This is Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and today we're going to go full cloak and dagger with the British auxiliary units. And we have an expert with us for that's going to sort out all of that for us, and his name is Andrew Chatterton. Welcome to the show, Andrew, and I think we could start with you telling us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. Yeah, I'm Andrew Chatterton. I'm a Second World War historian, and I tend to focus on the highly secret civilian groups that were put in place in Britain to counter a German invasion or an occupation. And there were thousands and thousands of British civilians involved, and I'd say probably 80 to 90% of them went to the grave without telling anyone. They didn't tell wives or husbands or family or friends, and didn't get any official recognition. So yeah, I tend to focus on those groups because it's just the most remarkable story, and it kind of goes against this, in Britain particularly, it goes against the perception we have of ourselves, particularly in 1940, of a bit rubbish and just kind of sitting back and waiting for the Germans to invade. But in fact, we were massively prepared.
Thanks for that, Andrew. I like the way you said that, and I think it's a certain generation. You mentioned taking it to the grave, so that kind of silent generation, a little bit. If we can go back in time, maybe we can say stuff up a lip and hard as nails and all that. But building on that and looking at the defense of Britain during the Second World War, could you unpack the establishment and role of the British auxiliary units?
Yeah, so it all starts. It kind of starts from two places, but it starts pre-war, and this is the kind of start of the story, really, because and it kind of the start of going against this perception that Britain was unprepared. Britain was preparing for and thinking about ways of how countries could resist invasion in non-traditional military methods. So for example, SIS or MI6 set up Section D under a chap called Lawrence Grand in about 1938. And Section D was all about thinking about alternative ways of fighting an enemy. And the enemy was, obviously at that point, Nazi Germany. So Lawrence Grand was going around to the countries surrounding Nazi Germany, like Czechoslovakia and Poland and even the Nordics, and discussing with them ways that they could resist an invasion, but also talking about ways of using black propaganda, of using what we call now fake news, starting resistance groups in these areas. So, for example, he was in the Skoda works in Czechoslovakia just before the Germans invaded, talking to the factories about how they could put their plants out of action so they didn't fall into the Germans' hands. But obviously, all of this came a bit too late, because by kind of 37, 38, Germany was on the move, and it was all a bit too late to put this stuff into place. And it soon became apparent that it wasn't countries in mainland Europe that might need this kind of pre-prepared civilian organisations, but in fact Britain itself. And so Grand was brought back to Britain, and he set up something called the Home Defence Scheme in very early 1940, which essentially was using his experience and his discussions that he'd had in mainland Europe in the late 30s and implementing it in Britain. So he recruited, by the very early summer of 1940, he had about 1,000 civilians recruited, and he liberally armed them with explosives and weapons, and all without a great deal of training, it has to be said.
Well,
and when the military when General Ironside, who was CNC Home Forces, got to hear about this, he was pretty mad, because essentially Grand was planting explosives in bridges without telling anyone, and handing out large amounts of explosives and weapons to civilians. But it was the right type of thinking, and this links into something that the military were doing themselves. So military intelligence research was set up again in the kind of late 1930s, and it was the military thinking about alternative ways of fighting an enemy, and it started to think about resistance groups and the use of civilians. So very similar to what Section D was doing under Grand. And then Anthony Eden, who was Minister of War in 1940, went down to have a chat with Lieutenant General Andrew Thorne, who was commander of 12 Corps in the southeastern corner. So Kent and Sussex are really vulnerable to invasion from Europe. And Thorne was kind of chatting about the lack of anti-tank guns and things like that, but also mentioned about his time as military attaché in Berlin during the 1930s, and he'd got to learn about the German peasant militia, which had been around since the kind of 1700s. But essentially what it meant was the German peasants had caches of weapons buried on their lord's land, and if an enemy army kind of passed through, they would disappear and grab the weapons, and what they kind of lacked in military training in numbers, they made up for in knowledge of the local environment and where best an ambush could take place and all that kind of stuff. And Thorne thought this could be, replicated within Britain. Eden took it back to Churchill, who obviously absolutely loved the idea. And so they started to think about prototype what these units might look like. And they started with a guy called Peter Fleming in Kent. And Peter Fleming's the brother of Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. And Peter Fleming started these units with his brother Richard, actually, down in Kent. And he was recruiting kind of local farmers and gamekeepers and farm workers, people who had this kind of intimate knowledge of the countryside around them, and was teaching them how to use explosives and sabotage and things like that. And it quickly became apparent this could be a really useful anti-invasion group. And so Ironside and Churchill essentially grabbed what Grand was doing with the Home Defence Scheme, which was, good thinking, but pretty unorganised and pretty ropey, and joined it and merged it with what Peter Fleming was doing in Kent. And that's the creation of the auxiliary units. And they put a guy called Colin Gubbins in charge, who later went up to head up SOE, and Colonel Gubbins was in charge of extending these units to all the vulnerable counties of Britain. And by the end of the war, the Aux units kind of went from right at the top of the country, so the Orkneys, the islands off the top of Scotland, all the way down the east coast of Scotland, the northeast coast of Britain, east coast, southeast corner, south coast, into the southwest where I am in Devon, and up to South Wales. There's nothing really up from South Wales on the west side because they didn't perceive a threat coming from Ireland. So it's only kind of the counties that were facing mainland Europe. And by the end of the war, we think there's about 6,500 men who joined these auxiliary units. And they were all men in reserved occupations. They tended to be, as I say, kind of farmers or gamekeepers. And gamekeepers, we've got evidence of gamekeepers recruiting poachers because they knew the poachers understood the countryside around them, could move stealthily and set traps and things like that. Or in other areas that they were like quarrymen, or in South Wales, they tended to be miners. So again, they had the advantage of handling explosives all the time. And these are really tough, strong young men who would otherwise be called up to the regular forces, but were in jobs that were important to the country, so didn't called up. So this isn't. There's a program in the 1970s called Dad's Army that was based on the Home Guard here in Britain, that basically portrayed Britain's civilian defences as all elderly, inept old men. It was a comedy, and that's the brush that has kind of tarred Britain's defences since. But yeah, this was anything but Dad's Army.
It's kind of scary, Andrew, because when we're talking about this, it could actually be we could be talking about what is happening today in the world, and this is basically what it's starting to look like again. And also, I got this distinct Eye of the Needle vibe. I don't know if you've seen that with skillfully played by Donald Sutherland back in the day when he had a long knife, and he was very good at killing.
Yeah,
and romance, of course.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
but I have another question. And now we presented the auxiliary units, and I would like to know a little bit more about something that was called the Special Duties Branch. What was that, and what were they doing in this context?
Yeah, so the Special Duties Branch is quite different, but related to the auxiliary unit. So the auxiliary unit's role was essentially to wait for the German invasion to literally go over the top of them. They would disappear to secret underground bunkers, come out at night and blow up German infrastructure. So this is about slowing down the German advance to give the British regular forces time to kind of regroup and counterattack. So they would do anything that would slow that. So blowing up ammo and fuel dumps, railway lines, trains, bridges, airfields, country houses that have been taken as German HQs, assassinating British officers, assassinating German officers, and assassinating British collaborators. So anything that would slow down. So obviously in France and Belgium, as the spearhead kind of flew through, the supply chain kept fairly up to speed and kept the frontline troops supplied with everything that they would need to keep going. And this was about stopping that process and allowing the British regular troops to counter. The Special Duties Branch recruited a very, very different type of person. So whereas the Orcs units were recruiting kind of farmers and miners and people like that, the Special Duties Branch were recruiting elderly women and mothers and vicars and doctors, people who could stand on their street in their town or village and watch the invading army kind of pass through. And all these guys were highly trained in recognizing German insignia and weapons and vehicles and direction of travel. They'd write down what they'd seen in very basic code on a piece of edible paper, which they'd then put under their tongue. They'd then go to a dead letter drop. So it might be something like as simple as like a tin on a windowsill or a loose brick in a graveyard wall, or something more sophisticated like there's a gate with a horseshoe nailed to the gate. If the horseshoe was facing up, there was no message. If it was facing down, there was a message. And in the side of the gate was a fake bolt. You pulled the bolt out, unscrewed the top, and inside it was hollow where the message could be put, or in a key in a church door, and you could unscrew the top of the key and it was hollow inside, so the message could be put in there. Or there's like a fake tree stump. So if you imagine, it looks like a tree's been kind of chopped down, but at the top there's kind of you could revolve the top around, put your message in a split tennis ball, and then push the tennis ball down this kind of fake tree stump, and it rolled down to the next dead letter drop, or to a civilian wireless operator where these messages ended up. And the civilian wireless operator would then pass this information on via wireless. It was all voice, no need to teach them how to use Morse code or any kind of coding. So it's all voice. And they'd be sending this information on to ATS women, so Auxiliary Territorial Service women, which is the women's side of the British Army at the time. They were in secret bunkers, rather like the auxiliary units guys were. And they would be sending this information on to GHQ to allow GHQ to make informed, timely decisions about British counterattack. So again, learning the lessons from mainland Europe about the speed at which the Germans kind of sped through and attacked, and would just appear in a French village and then speed off, and no one would know where they were going or what their aims were. This is about taking some of that mystery away from the so-called blitzkrieg, and allowing British commanders to make informed decisions about British counterattack.
Smart.
Yeah.
Very smart.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And I see Ian Fleming didn't have to go very far for some of those cool ideas for his books.
No, exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah, it all makes sense.
Oh, it totally does. And sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, quick checkpoint. If you're finding value in this episode, leave us a review on your app. It really makes a difference. Watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button to stay sharp. Now back to it.
Also in your research, Andrew, you mentioned Section 7. Could you explain to our listeners a little bit about Section 7 cells and their purpose during the Second World War?
Yeah, so whilst the auxiliary units and the Special Duties Branch were purely an anti-invasion groups, so they both had life expectancies of about 2 weeks. So the auxiliary units, for example, had enough rations to last them for 2 weeks, but that was pretty much how they were pretty expected to survive that long, because they were out every night blowing stuff up, and at some point or another, the Germans would have caught them.
That's hardcore.
Yeah, and the same with the Special Duties Branch. You know, you've got, if you're an elderly woman and you get caught with a piece of edible paper in your mouth with a code on, you're going to get taken and tortured. But I should say, all of these groups were siloed. So an auxiliary unit patrol made up of kind of 6 to 8 men in their underground bunker. Once the Germans were in that area and they'd disappeared and their families had no idea where they'd gone, they were set in their bunkers, and there was no outside instructions coming in. They were completely isolated. They also didn't know where the next bunker was along. So in some cases, you know, they're every kind of 5 to 6 miles, but they had no idea who was in the next bunker or where it was located, just in case they got caught. So I should say that just because it's quite important. So that both those groups are purely anti-invasion, no expectation of any long-term resistance at all, just a short, sharp snap at the heel of the invading army.
I mean, that's the dream. That's a dream job, right?
Right.
The short life expectancy, and
Yeah, exactly.
you have to sacrifice everything.
Yeah, exactly right.
Where do I sign up?
Yeah, yeah. Section 7, on the other hand, is a group that have just become apparent, I'd say, in the last kind of decade or so. For a long time, we got information through about, my granddad or my grandma was definitely in the auxiliary units, that on their deathbed they talked about being trained in unarmed combat and handling explosives and blah blah blah. But actually they were from Birmingham, which is in the middle of the country, or Liverpool, which is on the west side of the country. So we knew they weren't in auxiliary units, and for a long time it was all a bit of a mystery. Until about 2010, a guy called Keith Jeffrey published the official history of MI6. And in that official history, there's about 3 paragraphs, all unreferenced, about this group called Section 7 that was set up in early 1940. And Section 7 is about not an anti-invasion role, but a long-term resistance role, had Britain been defeated and occupied by the Germans. So this is about much more in line with the kind of French resistance, but it's all pre-prepared. So we've got evidence of teenage boys being kind of 14-year-olds being trained how to be snipers, 15, 16-year-old girls being trained how to be kind of honey traps. There's a lady called Irene Lockley who's up near Leeds in Yorkshire. She told her daughter that she was in a resistance group with her father, her uncle, and 2 of her cousins, based in a cave near where they lived, and her role would be to blow up railway tracks after German occupation, to the use of Molotov cocktails against troops, assassinate, basically making the life of the occupying forces as difficult as possible. Section 7 also seems to have had other roles within a resistance group. Section 7 was also seemingly responsible for sending information about the occupying forces to a government in exile, probably in Canada, because we know, for example, in Matlock there was a cell there with a wireless set in a draper's shop, and you go in the draper's shop, be like a set of shelves. You pull one of the shelves, the whole shelf moves, the whole cupboard moves. In behind is where the wireless was, and there are 2 female wireless operators there, and they would be given information by kind of spies on the street, including kind of 14-year-old boys, send information to these women, and they'd be sending it on, we don't know where exactly, but sending it on probably to a government in exile, so they knew exactly what was going on. They'd have some kind of inside knowledge of what was going on in the country. There's also an escape line set up seemingly through the middle of the country. There was an expectation that if the Germans had occupied Britain, that like France, there would be an occupied zone, and that was expected to be kind of England and Wales, and an unoccupied zone, which was expected to be Scotland. And this escape line, again made up of teenage boys, seems to have been set up. So if you commit an act of sabotage or you're on the run from the occupying forces, there is a line already set up of resistance boys who could then take you to the unoccupied zone and then potentially to safety across the sea. So hugely prepared for the worst case scenario. We have very little, well, there's no paper trail at all. What we tend to rely on now are these families kind of coming to us and saying, oh, my uncle thought he was in a resistance group, but he couldn't have been, and then he tells the tale, and we say, well, he could have been, actually. I spoke to a lady the other day after doing one of my talks. She said he was a GP in near Leeds again, and when they were clearing out his dispensary in the late 90s, they found huge numbers of hundreds of rounds of ammunition, rifles in grease, in boxes, files and files of morphine, and some explosives, and
wow,
100% he was part of this Section 7 resistance group.
That is, I mean, that's impressive, and I can say that I know we all know why Scotland would be unoccupied territory, of course. I mean, that's a given. And I'm also impressed how little we know, or how secret this was. But that means that they actually know how to do their job. Because if you look at it today, OPSEC is basically a joke most places, but also the information era is much faster now, but it's very impressive that they have kept it so secret. So you still have to rely on basically word of mouth, which I do like. It even makes it better.
Yeah, correct.
And this is a massive organization, seemingly extremely well prepared. How do you train all of these people? Because it's civilians, and the tasks that they're doing are, I mean, it's quite complex. This is what, you would require probably from a soldier at least 10 to 15 months of training, even if we take the weapons part away, only to recognize German uniforms and vehicles, all of that. So how do you train these people?
Yeah, so each of the groups had slightly different training. So the auxiliary units, the guys blowing stuff up and killing people, were trained at a place called Coleshill House, which is near Swindon in the west of the country. And 2 or 3 of them would get a letter saying, you need to get a train to Highworth, which is the nearest station to where the house was. They then had to make their way to the local post office, where they met the postmistress Mabel Stranks. They then give her a password. She'd go out the back, phone up Coleshill House, who would send a kind of truck round to the post office, throw these guys in the back, shut it all down, and then drive a convoluted route back to Coleshill House. So by the time these guys had arrived, they'd have absolutely no idea where they were. But at Coleshill House, they would do weekend training and everything that they would need. So that includes kind of digging and surviving in these underground bunkers, which are the most remarkable structures. In fact, so for example, most of these operational bases, as they're called, have a hatch that's kind of flush to the floor with foliage on top, so you can't see it. And then to open that, there's various different ways depending on the operational base. Some you stamp on the hatch and it pops up on a counterweight system and swivels round, allowing you access to the ladder. Others, each member of the patrol was issued with a different coloured marble, and you'd roll it down what looked like a mouse hole, but actually it'd roll in underground, a rattle in a tin, and the guys underground could let you in. Others, you'd pull what looked like a tree root, and that would either operate the counterweight system, or it'd ring a bell in the bunker, and they'd pop up the hatch again. You then go down about 12 or 15 feet down a ladder. At the bottom, you're kind of confronted by a blast wall. So if the Germans had found a way into the hatch and dropped a grenade down, the main chamber's protected. You go through the blast wall, and then you're into the main chamber where the kind of bunks are, and a table, and often a water tank. So this is where you are during the day, kind of resting, sleeping, and planning for the next night's operations. Then you're in through to a next section where there's kind of storage. There's often a chemical toilet in there. Sometimes there's a kitchen, which isn't ideal if you're cooking, to try and keep secret, but they'd funnel a chimney up a hollow tree, so the smoke dispersed at the top of the tree line, so it wouldn't kind of pass through a woods and kind of give it away. And then at the end of there's often an escape tunnel, which can lead up to kind of 60, 70 feet away, to give you some chance of escape if the Germans had found you. But essentially, most of them knew if the Germans had found your bunker, you were pretty much done for. But they're the most remarkable structures, and we're still finding them now. Anyway, so they're trained how to live in these things. They're trained how to move at night, how to dispatch sentries, how to mutilate bodies to scare the living daylights out of the fallen sentries' comrades, where to place explosives, all the stuff that you'd need to be an effective sabotaging and guerrilla fighter. And when they weren't at Coleshill, in each county there was 1 or 2 patrols that were made up of regular soldiers who would then train you locally. And in the event of invasion, that patrol of regular soldiers would become an auxiliary patrol in themselves. But during the period that there was no invasion, they were training these groups again in unarmed combat, in explosives, and moving at night, and everything you need to do for that. In terms of the Special Duties Branch, it's quite different. They were essentially handed, and we know a lot less about the Special Duties Branch in terms of training, but certainly they had a vast amount of paperwork that was sent to them that they had to send back at stand down. There was also some meetings where they were tested and taught, but it seemed to be a lot more onus on them learning it themselves. And in terms of Section 7, again, our knowledge at the moment is pretty vague on training. Presumably, like the auxiliary units and special duties branch, there were intelligence officers involved in pulling these groups together, and they would provide some form of training, because we know that what they were doing. Well, I mean, handling explosives safely is a pretty big task. Handling a weapon, how to pull together a Molotov cocktail, a vast amount of training had to be done. We know, we've had stories of, so for example, in Liverpool, a family got in touch saying that their father was a First World War veteran. He'd been a sharpshooter in the First World War, and he said on his deathbed that he was part of a secret group, and in the tunnels under the River Mersey in Liverpool, he was training 14-year-old boys how to be snipers. So there was certainly stuff out there. We've had other guys say that their relatives said that they were trained by, and lots of them used the same description of terrifying ex-NCOs in uniform but with no insignia, training them in the use of weapons and unarmed combat and things like that. So it looks like MI6, certainly for Section 7, were recruiting ex-military to train Section 7 operatives in everything they need to know.
That sounds reasonable. It's a big task, and it's especially when it comes to that, or what you have told us about them. It seems like you probably need to have some pre-qualifications to be able to meet those standards quickly.
Yeah. In lots of cases, certainly from an auxiliary unit, they tended to pick guys that had that knowledge and experience in some cases, and let's not forget, plenty of, even if you were kind of 18, let's say at the end of the First World War, and you had some fighting experience and war experience, you're only in your kind of 30s in the Second World War, and you're still very capable of training or being part of these resistance groups, and you're still young enough and fit enough to be effective.
And I'm glad that you're mentioning that you're still in the game in your 40s and 30s.
Yeah. Yeah, correct. Exactly right. I cling on to that.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, I was just listening to Bruce Springsteen's Glory Days, right? So, I mean, we gotta do it. What we have to do. I mean, when Max says it sounds reasonable, I was thinking it sounds bloody amazing. And I was just thinking, you spoke about the training and how they've done some of that pretty specialized training. And then I know I joked about signing up for this earlier if I was there. I'm just wondering how they actually recruited those civilians for those very secretive roles.
Yeah, so the auxiliary units had an intelligence officer that was allocated to each county. They usually had some form of affiliation with that county. And they'd go to, say where I am in Devon, they'd come to Devon and they'd identify a town or a village that was strategically placed. So it might be near a key bridge over a river, or it might be over a key junction on a railway. It might be near a big country house that's likely to be taken by the Germans as a local HQ. Or it might be that you're near. So one of the patrols near me is quite near the Cotton family house, and the Cottons were leading members of the British Union of Fascists, and had met Hitler personally in Germany in the 30s. They'd hosted von Ribbentrop a few times when he was ambassador to Britain in the 30s, and these guys were very, very likely to be collaborators and to assist the Germans invading. So the likely target for this patrol would have been this British family of BUF members. But the IO would go, and he would then, once he'd identified the kind of town or city or town or village that was well strategically placed, he would then identify a kind of key man in that town or village. So a farmer or a farm or a gamekeeper, someone with a bit of sway, a bit of influence, but also obviously still had those core skills of handling weapons and understanding the countryside around them. And then essentially it was up to the patrol, that key man who would become the patrol lead, to recruit his own patrol. And because of the secrecy around this, everyone signed the Official Secrets Act. He tended to pick friends and relatives and colleagues, one, because he could trust them, but two, because they also probably had the similar skill set that was desirable. So the patrol leader would then also choose the best location for this operational base. That's the start of that kind of isolated, siloed approach. But that's how the Orcs units recruited. Very similar for Special Duties Branch. So an intelligence officer would be sent out to the county. And the Special Duties Branch and auxiliary units, because of their anti-invasion roles, tended to operate in the same county, so mainly coastal counties. An IO would be sent out, identify a key person. Again, because of the nature of the role, it wouldn't be a farmer or something like that. It's much more likely to be a vicar or a doctor, and they would be then recruited, and they'd recruit their own cell of spies, the people looking at the German army passing through, and runners, the ones taking the messages on. The key person tended to be the radio operator, so they would take that role themselves. And when it came to Section 7, we can only presume that something similar happened, that some form of intelligence officer was sent out to recruit and find a key man within a town or a village, or a city indeed, and they tended to recruit people who could remain in their profession after occupation. So a shopkeeper or a vicar or a doctor or a dentist, someone who could keep going during an occupation, but also it wouldn't appear suspicious that people were coming in and out of their place of work all of the time. So you could almost hide it in plain sight. And so, yeah, we suspect that's very similar to how the other two groups were recruited. It certainly seems that each cell within Section 7 had one of these key men who then recruited their own cell.
Quick pause. If you're enjoying this episode, why not buy us a beer? It's the best way to keep Underground Strategy sharp and running. Hit undergroundstrategy.com/support to fuel the mission. Cheers to you. Let's get back into it. When you speak about this, and you say that we assume a lot, and I say that with respect that it should have, but I was thinking, because you're also an author, you've been writing a book, and you have done a lot of research in this area. And how hard was it, or how much material is it out there? Because it seems to be quite scarce. And how hard is it to research this specific niche of yours?
Yeah, yeah. It is hard, but I mean, if it was easy, it wouldn't be any fun, would it? So the auxiliary units, there is, I'd say, a fair amount of paperwork and sources available. Kind of 1943, it was decided that they would record at least the names and addresses of the guys who were in the auxiliary units at that stage. And that was recorded and put under the Official Secrets Act that was released in the kind of early 2000s. So we have a lot of names and addresses of people which we can then look at and collate them into a patrol and look at a map and think, well, actually, that's a key target there. Their operational base is probably somewhere around there. And then we'd do some local research or put an article out in the local newspaper asking whether anyone's fallen down a hole in a wood recently. So we have a fair bit of information about AUX units. Special Duties Branch, we have less paperwork, but what we find is and the auxiliary is the paperwork tends to be misfiled because it comes to someone in the archives and they're not really sure what it's to do. Is it home guard? Is it regular up? And they're not entirely sure. So it's filed away. So you have to do a lot of detective work to find it.
But do you think there is a treasure trove somewhere in the intelligence archives that they will release someday? They are sitting on this big chest of goodies.
Yeah, there's rumours that a similar list of Special Duties Branch operatives was produced. And in fact, we've just found a huge list in South Wales, in the local archives in South Wales, which has kind of changed our perception of the Special Duties Branch because each cell seems to be much larger than we thought before, and gave us kind of details on codes that they use and things like that. And Section 7, there's zero paperwork apart from this mention within the official history and the fact that we have lots of families coming to us and telling us very similar stories from across the whole country. So whereas the auxiliary units and Special Duties Branch are purely coastal counties, Section 7 is the whole of the country. So there's potentially tens of thousands of civilians involved in Section 7. And I'd say we know maybe 10 people, individuals. And there has to be a paper trail connected with Section 7. There has to be, because someone had to pay for all this stuff for a start. but it's certainly not been released yet. And I wonder, I think there's two things. I wonder whether, number one, because of the age of the people they're recruiting and what they were asking them to do, that might go under a much heavier or a longer secrecy act. So it might be a 100-year rule or something like that, because they were asking teenage boys and girls to, assassinate people and be honey traps and things like that.
Yeah. How long is the basic secrecy act that you have in the UK now for this kind of things?
It's about 50 years. But I suspect Section 7 is 100 or may never be released. And also, we're meant to be the goodies, right?
Yep.
There's a Second World War is very, we're the goodies and the Nazis are the baddies. So very easy to understand. But if you're teaching 14 and 15-year-old kids how to assassinate people, suddenly
it's a tough sell.
Yeah, suddenly we don't seem to be quite as goody as we might otherwise perceive ourselves. And I think also there's a very good chance that some of this stuff continued into the Cold War, that there were groups ready for some kind of Russian invasion or similar. Certainly, we know that there was a stay-behind group within West Germany made of British armies that were there to, if the Russians had come across, they would wait for the Russians to come across. Again, they're in kind of bunkers. They would come out and hit the Russians from behind. So certainly there was within the military forces, and I suspect, I don't know for certain, but I suspect something similar might have been in place in the 50s from a civilian perspective as well.
Yeah, I'm quite sure. We had the same in Sweden,
right? From
the 50s all the way up to the Cold War, maybe now. And the problem with that, we also have stay behind actually, and that is that the secrecy, or because they're just reforming themselves, so it's basically the same unit, so it will never be released because there is a brother or a sister unit to that even in place today. I would guess so.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and in Britain, the Home Guard was reformed in the early 50s or mid-50s to counter a Russian threat, and it just wouldn't surprise me that the Yorkshire units or the special or whatever were reformed as well. So.
And that concludes part 1 of our 2-part series on British auxiliary units with Andrew Chatterton. We will be back next week with part 2, so stand by for that. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.